The first time Clara met Alexander Hale, she nearly dropped the tray of medication she carried. He looked nothing like the other patients tucked into the sterile corners of the ICU. Even surrounded by beeping machines and sterile light, he held an air of something untouched, something untouchable. His hair was neatly trimmed, dark against the stark whiteness of the pillow. His face, unshaven but still commanding, bore the rugged handsomeness of a man used to controlling every room he entered. Clara adjusted the blanket over his legs with careful hands. She had heard whispers from the other nurses, billionaire real estate magnate, single mysterious accident under unclear circumstances. No family had come to visit, no friends, only his lawyer once a week dropping off papers no one dared read. Poor man, Clara murmured under her breath, smoothing the sheet across his chest. She watched the slow rise and fall of his breathing. The rhythm was steady, perfect, almost too perfect. The longer she stood there, the more the room felt crowded with a tension she could not explain. Outside, life spun forward. In the break room, nurses laughed over hospital gossip. Doctors barked orders down sterile corridors. New lives entered the world 2 floors down while others slipped quietly from it each night. But in this room, time slowed. Clara found herself returning to him after her shifts, sometimes even during. She read aloud from books she loved, her voice soft in the hush. She played pieces of piano music on her phone and let it fill the silence. She told him small things, how she had spilled coffee down her scrubs, how her neighbor's dog barked all night, how she longed to see the ocean again. It was on a rain-soaked Thursday when the first tear fell from her cheek onto the back of her hand. She had leaned close, speaking low about the exhaustion curling inside her, about how lonely it was to always be the one taking care of others. "I don't even know why I'm telling you this," she whispered, wiping her cheek quickly. "You can't hear me." She turned to leave. Behind her, the slightest movement, a twitch of a hand, went unnoticed. Unknown to Clara, Alexander Hale heard every word. From the moment she first spoke to him, something deep and cold inside him cracked. He had been pretending, choosing silence over the ruthless vultures who waited for him to wake, to sign his life away with trembling fingers they thought he could no longer control. He had planned to stay silent until he could figure out who he could trust. He had not planned on Clara. In the sterile, lonely kingdom of machines and antiseptic, her voice was the only real thing. It slid into his fortress like sunlight through cracked shutters, warming places he had forgotten he had. At first, he thought it was weakness. He clenched invisible fists around his resolve. But the more she came, the more she talked, the more he found himself straining to hear her, to remember her every word. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. That night when she cried beside him, something broke in a way he could not pretend to ignore. His heart, stubbornly dormant to the world, stirred. Alexander Hale decided he would open his eyes. But not yet. He needed to understand who Clara was, why she had touched something so carefully protected. And most importantly, whether he dared reach for her in a life he no longer trusted. The next morning, Clara entered room 509 balancing a fresh vase of sunflowers against her hip. The flowers were a ridiculous indulgence on her nurse's salary, but somehow she had found herself at the market after her shift, standing before rows of blooms, thinking only of him. Of Alexander. She hadn't called him that out loud yet, the name sat too intimately on her tongue. Clara arranged the flowers on the side table, shifting aside the clipboard with its neat clinical notes. Heart rate stable, no spontaneous movements observed, GCS score unchanged. She hated the cold detachment of it all. It reduced him to a chart, a list of symptoms, when she had seen the stubborn life still pulsing beneath his skin. Pulling up a chair, Clara settled beside his bed, resting her elbows on her knees. Her voice was raw from the night shift, but she spoke anyway. "You'd hate this, you know," she said, watching his face for the 1000th time for some flicker, some sign. Being trapped here, treated like a thing instead of a person. She smiled faintly, a rueful twist of her lips. "I Googled you," she confessed. "Not very professional, but you were everywhere. Magazines, interviews, photos of you in suits that probably cost more than my car." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You looked so alive, not like this." Without thinking, she reached out and brushed her fingers lightly over the back of his hand. His skin was warm, solid. A surge of emotion swelled up in her chest, threatening to drown her. She squeezed her eyes shut. "You have to fight," she said fiercely. "You can't just stay like this. I don't care how rich you are or how broken you feel. You have to try." She didn't see the slight clenching of his jaw. She didn't notice the almost imperceptible pressure against her fingertips. But he was trying. Alexander lay trapped in the prison of his body, listening to her every word. Fight, she had said. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him not as a symbol, not as an asset, but as a man. He remembered the day of the accident in brutal flashes, the screech of tires, the sharp snap of impact, the shouts blurred by the ringing in his ears. In the days after, he realized the danger wasn't from his injuries but from the people he trusted. His lawyer, his board members, his so-called friends. They circled like vultures, speaking over him as if he were already dead, preparing to carve up the empire he had built from nothing. He decided to pretend, to listen, to plan. It had been easy at first. He had trained himself to need nothing, no one. Until Clara. Until her voice cut through the fog and made him feel human again. Alexander wanted to open his eyes more than he wanted anything in the world, but years of instinct screamed at him to wait, to be sure. Trust was not a luxury he could afford. Yet somehow he trusted her, the girl with tired eyes and strong hands, the one who stayed when no one else did. The one who whispered not of money or power, but of loneliness and dreams and rain. If he had the strength, he would have taken her hand in his and promised he would find a way back to her. That he would fight, not for his fortune, not for his pride, but for the girl who had unknowingly become his lifeline. He just needed a little more time. And Clara, stubborn, tender Clara, was not going to give up on him. The hospital held its breath during the quiet hours before dawn. Shadows stretched long across the waxed floors, and the scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air. Most of the world slept, but Clara was awake, sitting cross-legged in the uncomfortable hospital chair, her scrubs wrinkled, her hair escaping its loose braid. She had finished her shift hours ago, but hadn't found the will to leave. Instead, she stayed in Alexander's room, reading softly from a battered novel she found tucked in the staff lounge. She didn't know if he could hear her, but the act itself comforted her, anchoring her to something steady amidst the chaos of her fraying life. Midway through a paragraph, she paused, glancing up. The smallest sound, a hitch in his breath, almost too faint to be real, caught her attention. Clara froze, heart pounding. She leaned closer, her hand trembling slightly as she brushed her fingers against his wrist. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. No response. Maybe she imagined it. Maybe exhaustion was making her see things that weren't there. She slumped back into the chair, cradling her forehead in her hands. She hated the way hope had leapt in her chest, fierce and bright, only to crash. For a long moment she sat there, struggling to steady her breathing. "You're not allowed to leave me," she said quietly, not caring any more who might hear. "Not when she cut herself off, pressing her lips together. It was foolish, she knew, falling for a man who couldn't even open his eyes. Falling because he had become her confessional, her secret listener, her silent companion. But she couldn't deny it anymore. Somewhere between the flowers and the songs and the late-night conversations he would never answer, Clara had given her heart away. And he didn't even know. From the prison of stillness, Alexander raged against his useless body. He heard her. He heard everything. And when she whispered, "Not when something inside him snapped like a taut wire finally stretched too far. He needed to get back to her. Not because of what he had to protect, not because of the empire waiting like a loaded gun at his bedside. Because she needed him. And he needed her. Alexander summoned everything inside him, digging deeper than he ever had before. His body screamed in protest, his muscles burning from weeks of disuse, but he refused to be caged any longer. He had stayed silent long enough. Slowly, agonizingly, he moved his fingers. It wasn't much, just a slight curl of his hand toward hers. But it was enough. Clara gasped. Her eyes flew to his face. She rose from the chair so fast it toppled behind her. "Alexander," she cried, grabbing his hand, "if you can hear me, squeeze my fingers." There was a long, heart-stopping pause. And then the faintest pressure, weak, trembling, but unmistakable. A sob broke from Clara's chest, so raw it filled the sterile room with something living and wild. She pressed her forehead against his hand, tears spilling freely now. "I'm here," she whispered fiercely. "I'm not going anywhere, I swear." For the first time in weeks, Alexander Hale opened his eyes. The ceiling lights were too bright, the world blurring at the edges. But he only saw her, the girl with tear-streaked cheeks, with a stubborn, shining soul that had refused to give up on him. "Clara." He tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped. You're safe, she said, choking on a laugh that was half sob, half prayer. You're going to be okay, I promise. In that moment, Alexander didn't care about anything else. Not the fortune, not the betrayal, not the war waiting for him outside those walls. Only her. Only the woman who had saved him not with grand gestures, but with a million small acts of devotion stitched into the quiet hours between heartbeats. Only Clara. The days that followed were a fragile rebirth. Alexander's recovery was slow, brutal in its honesty. Muscles that had forgotten how to move needed to be coaxed back to life. Speech returned in fragments, his voice hoarse and broken from disuse. The world outside his hospital room loomed like a storm cloud, full of questions he wasn't ready to answer. But Clara was there through every agonizing step. She fed him ice chips when he couldn't swallow. She encouraged him with every exhausting session of physical therapy, cheering him on when his legs trembled under his own weight. She stayed past her shifts, her eyes soft and steadfast, refusing to let him fall into despair. Sometimes he found her asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head lolling against her shoulder, a blanket tucked loosely around her. In those quiet moments, he let himself look at her fully, without fear or pretense. The way her hair slipped free of its braid, the tiny crease between her brows when she worried, the gentleness in her touch when she thought he was too tired to notice. He owed her more than gratitude. He owed her the truth. But telling the truth meant tearing open old wounds, both his and hers. One evening, after a long, painful session with his therapist, Clara found him staring out the window. His wheelchair was parked at an awkward angle, the hospital gown loose over his thin frame. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, a galaxy of careless brilliance. Without a word, she sat down beside him. They listened to the hum of the night together. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice still rough but stronger now. I wasn't unconscious, he said. Clara turned to him slowly, searching his face. I heard everything, he continued, keeping his gaze on the window. From the first day you came, every word you read, every story you told me. A long silence stretched between them. I thought, Clara began, but her voice broke. She swallowed hard. I thought you were gone. I know, he said quietly. I made you believe that. I'm sorry. Her hands twisted in her lap. Why? She asked, her voice a raw whisper. Alexander closed his eyes, gathering himself. There were people who wanted me dead, not physically, but legally. If I woke too soon, too weak, they would have controlled everything, signed away everything I built. I had to be sure, I had to wait. Clara's throat tightened. She thought of the lonely hours she had spent by his side, offering pieces of herself to a man she thought was unreachable. But you trusted me, she said, more a statement than a question. He turned then, meeting her gaze for the first time without barriers. You were the only real thing in this place, he said simply. You didn't want anything from me. Tears filled Clara's eyes, hot and blinding. She didn't know what to say, how to bridge the gap between them, between the man who had built walls around his soul and the woman who had unknowingly slipped through them. Instead, she reached for his hand. For once, Alexander didn't hesitate. His fingers closed around hers, shaky but sure. And for the first time since the accident, he smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile of a man used to masking his true feelings. A real smile, soft, earned. It was Clara's undoing. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead lightly against his. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. In the quiet, they found something stronger than words. A beginning. A home. Outside the room, unseen by either of them, a pair of sharp-eyed men in expensive suits watched through the small window in the door. One of them pulled out a phone, whispering urgently into it. Inside, unaware of the storm gathering beyond the hospital walls, Alexander and Clara held onto each other. And for the first time, neither of them felt alone. The next morning came wrapped in pale gold light, slanting through the blinds and softening the harsh edges of the hospital room. Clara helped Alexander into the chair by the window again, her hands steady, her touch careful but confident. He was getting stronger. Each day, his voice grew clearer, his gaze sharper, but there was a tension brewing under the surface that Clara couldn't ignore. Something was coming. She saw it in the way he looked at the door sometimes, his shoulders tensing as if he expected it to burst open. She saw it in the hurried conversations between doctors and administrators when they thought no one was watching. Alexander was a man caught between two worlds, the fragile recovery they had built together and the ruthless life he had left suspended outside these walls. She didn't ask questions, she knew he would tell her when he was ready. That afternoon, Alexander asked for real clothes. No more hospital gowns, no more blankets tucked under his chin like he was a child. Clara found a simple button-up shirt and jeans that someone from administration must have dropped off weeks ago and helped him change, blushing furiously when his fingers brushed hers. He caught her hand before she could retreat. "Stay," he said. So she did. Sitting beside him, Clara let him gather the words he needed. "They're coming," Alexander said finally, his voice low. "The board members, the ones who tried to take everything." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "What will you do?" she asked. His mouth twisted into something grim and certain. "Fight." He turned to her, his eyes so clear it stole the breath from her lungs. "But not just for the company," he said, "not anymore." She didn't dare ask what else he meant, she didn't need to. It was there, plain between them in the weight of his gaze, in the way his thumb traced slow circles over the back of her hand. They sat there until a sharp knock sounded against the door. The suits entered without waiting for permission. Three men, expensive watches gleaming under their cuffs, carrying the scent of polished ambition. They smiled with thin politeness, but their eyes betrayed them. They expected to find a broken man, easy to manipulate, grateful to be led. What they found was Alexander Hale, sitting upright, eyes clear, voice steady. "Mr. Hale," one of them said smoothly, "we're here to discuss the transfer of your assets. You'll find everything prepared for your convenience." Alexander didn't move, didn't blink. "I'm not signing anything," he said. A flicker of confusion crossed the man's face. "You've been through a great deal," another chimed in, gentler now, the way someone might coax a stubborn child. "Let us handle the burden for you." Alexander's smile was cold as steel. "I said no." Behind him, Clara stood silent and strong, her presence a quiet pillar he drew strength from. The men pressed harder. They spoke of lawsuits, public scandals, court-appointed guardianships. Alexander listened, unmoved. When they finally realized they had lost, one of them leaned in close, dropping the facade entirely. "You'll regret this," he hissed under his breath. "You're alone, Hale, you always were." Alexander's eyes flickered once, not toward the suits but toward Clara, standing at his side. "No," he said quietly, "I'm not." The men left with clipped words and sharp glances, their defeat sour in the air. When the door closed behind them, Alexander sagged back in his chair, his strength momentarily spent. Clara knelt beside him, her hands finding his without hesitation. "You were brilliant," she said, her voice shaking with relief. He squeezed her fingers, lifting them to his lips in a gesture so tender it made her eyes sting. "I couldn't have done it without you," he murmured. She laughed, soft and wet with tears. "You're stronger than you know," she said. "So are you," he replied. The sun slid lower, casting the room in molten light. Shadows lengthened, soft and golden. Alexander touched her cheek with the back of his hand, tracing the line of her jaw with aching reverence. "I don't want to lose you," he said. "You're not going to," Clara whispered. "I'm right here." And when he leaned in, awkward and trembling from the weight of his healing body, she met him halfway. The kiss was not perfect, it was clumsy and a little desperate, but it was real, and it was enough. More than enough. In that moment they built something stronger than fear, stronger than betrayal, stronger than loss. Something no one could steal. When they finally broke apart, resting their foreheads together, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and bright and terrifying. But they would face it together. Not as nurse and patient. Not as billionaire and caregiver. As two broken souls who had found each other when neither of them knew they were still searching. As two people who had chosen, against every odd, to believe in second chances. And love, slow and patient and true, would do the rest.